Hello everyone, this is Mr. John from Areteem Institute with this week's Thursday Tidbit talking about web browser usage and visualizing trends. So, inspiration this week is that Microsoft is ending support for Internet Explorer, i.e. a web browser that has a 20 plus year history. I think it's around 25 or even more than that years, right? And I know that it's not a very popular browser now, which we'll see, but this was a dominant browser in the 2000s, right? It peaked at 90% plus market share. And so really almost anybody who was going on the internet was using Internet Explorer. So its history does have kind of a big dominance, and right, it's being ended now. And so it's a good time to look back and kind of try to visualize and analyze some of these trends. Right, and we can start doing that. We're going to focus on data from 2009 onwards, right? Because around 2010, we really had some competitors. Firefox, Chrome, Safari were just starting out around those times, and it'll be interesting to look at some of those trends and see what happened throughout the years today. So first, right, we want to kind of ask, what kind of data can be used to visualize this competition? How can we analyze it? How can we visualize it? And things like that. So our first type of data, and this is going to be the main data. This is the most common thing you will see if people are talking about browsers, right? Which browser is being used the most. It's this kind of idea of market share or usage share, right? It's based on how often browsers visit popular websites. Now, there's a little bit of difference here, right? They're not actually polling people, what browser do you use? We'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. That data is hard to come by, right? But it's kind of just saying, okay, our websites can see which browsers being used to view them. So if we look at a ton of popular websites, we can get a good idea roughly of what browsers people are using. So there's some data with this on Wikipedia, right? And some of the specific data, which I will link some Excel sheets in the description below, are based on this statcounter.com as well. So let's start with 2010. So I said this is where things were starting to change, right? Internet Explorer still had a pretty sizable lead on any competitors, but other things like Firefox had 30% market share there. Remember, this is based on what websites are being visited and then the browsers that people are using to see those popular websites. And we see Chrome starting out almost 10%, Safari and other that way too. So the question is, right, how might we visualize this? Of course, a table is a good place to start, right? So this kind of gives us all the data we need. If we look at the numbers, we can think about that there, right? We might look at a bar chart, things like that too. I would argue probably the best way, especially with percentages, right? We're talking about market share out of 100%. So we can visualize that pretty nicely with a circle and what's called a pie chart, right? So here we have our pie chart in this case. So this is a great way to visualize something like this, where we have our kind of data out of a whole 100% there, right? We can see, oh, it's pretty easy now. The Internet Explorer is like half the pie, right? Firefox is a little more than a quarter. That's a nice way of visualizing things there. So a lot of different ways to do this. This was just made with Excel. You can make these in Google Sheets. You can do these using programming, Python or C++, Java, right? Lots of different ways to make the charts. We're not going to discuss that too much today, but pie chart is a good way to visualize this as well. So let's go back to our other question here quick. We will explain and look at some stuff over time a tiny bit in this video, but let's go back to our how many users question. Remember, I said it's not easy. There's not many polls of, okay, we asked a bunch of people, what browser do you use, right? This usage was based on the website's visits. But, right, we do have pretty good estimates of how many people in the world use the internet, right? So again, we can look at Wikipedia for this. There's this other internetworldstats.com that has a lot of the data that I'm going to use today here, right? And this can be used to make some estimates. So how might we go about doing that? So our data, right? We have roughly 1.966 billion users in June 2020, 1.971 billion users in September 2010. How many users did Internet Explorer have in 2010, right? So our usage data was based on that year in total, and we want to use that estimate. So we estimate, okay, if we know that, this portion of people were visiting websites with Internet Explorer, right, to remind us of that data, right, the market share for Internet Explorer in that year, right? So if we look at the IE market share, that market share from our old data there was like 49.93%. So we know that roughly 49.93% of the websites visited were from Internet Explorer. And so we might estimate then that that number of users is going to be using Internet Explorer as well, right? That's a pretty natural thing to do. You could think about complications there or stuff like that as well. So, right, we might want then, right, the average total users, right? So the average total users in 2010, right? So that's what's going to be needed for our calculation here. Now, this is maybe a little bit tricky. We'll see this in other places. There's not a correct way. You might say we have two data points. Let's take the average. But for this example in particular, June is kind of in the middle of the year anyway. So let's just use that number here explicitly. Let's use that number right away. So let's say we have 1.966 billion in this case. So 1.96 billion in this scenario. Now, calculation from here is easy. So how do we find the number of users, right? We can just say, okay, we know that roughly 49.93% of those users were Internet Explorer users, and we multiply this 1.966 billion in this case. I am being careful with my units because if you do this, you will get 0.9816 billion, but let's write this as 981.6 million in this case. So a little bit of unit conversion there, but we know then how many million users were using Internet Explorer as an estimate, at least in 2010. So that's what we would have there. So let's repeat this a little bit to see some changes over time. So one way to do these things would be looking at these different years. So 2020, things have changed quite a bit here. So Internet Explorer is 1.35% market share. Chrome has taken a bunch, 64.6. Safari, other, growing there. Firefox is a lot less than it was before either. And again, let's look at the pie chart here. So we have our pie chart that really shows Chrome's dominance in this case. So we have that chart again that we could use, and you could compare the two charts to see what happens over time. That's a little bit of a spoiler for some stuff later, but that's good for now. Now, let's look at our Internet Explorer users in 2020. So here we have, right, new data. So now it's from March and December, and we want to estimate how many users Internet Explorer has in this case. So let's start with our market share again, right? Our Internet Explorer market share, we can use the same thing in this case. This is now updated for 2020, 1.35%. Now, I would argue in this scenario, it does make sense to talk about the average in this case, right? So the total users, right? Or let me say kind of average total users in 2020, right? In this case, I would say we probably want to do, okay, if we have data from kind of the beginning of the year and the end of the year, we could kind of do these and look at the average in that case. These numbers don't change all that much, but we might want to say we have 4.943 billion for that year in this scenario. You can argue about that. Maybe you want to always take the average. Maybe we always want to use kind of towards the end of the year or something. But, right, in this case, let's say we took the average to kind of find some middle ground towards the middle of the year. So, number of Internet Explorer users in 2020. Again, we can do the calculation pretty much the same way. 1.35% times 4.943 billion. And let me do the kind of conversion pretty quick here. We have 66.73 million in this scenario. So, right, a lot less than before, but right, that seems a little bit better at least than 1.35%, right? There's still 66 or roughly 67 million people using this browser in 2020 that way too. So, what are some questions and extensions we can do from here, right? So far, we've just examined those 2 years, 2010, 2020. You can do a lot with that, right? You can look back, compare the two tables, compare the two charts, compare the number of users. That does give you a good indication of how things changed. But as I mentioned, I am linking additional data from those other years below. So you can look at that in those linked data below too. And how might we really be able to better visualize this over time? Should we use the same graphs? Should we just make more of them? Are there other graph types that might be helpful? How could we go about putting those together? That's some of the stuff that we want to talk about and visualize for next time too. So next week we'll talk about this a little bit more, but think about the different charts. If you have the kind of know-how in Excel or programming, try to make some of the charts and think about, right, how might we want to visualize this? How might we want to best present, right, the Internet Explorer data? Do we want to present other data as well? Things like that too. And we'll discuss those more next week. So thank you for watching. Right, if you like this, hit the like button, subscribe, give comments for new ideas, give comments for, right, what graphs or types of data you might think could be helpful for next week. And stay tuned then, and we'll talk about that more next Thursday. So hopefully everybody has a great weekend. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.